It's Ramsey Dewey over here in Shanghai, China. Welcome to another edition of Q&A with the Coach. Just checking that my microphone was on because I've recorded a bunch of videos. A bunch of videos with hours of content where afterwards I realized the microphone wasn't on or it wasn't plugged in or some other minor detail like that, but we're rolling as far as I'm aware. Our friend Pico sends in this question. Video suggestion. How different are MMA training methods in China compared to the U.S.? Like, do the people in China train differently than the people in the U.S.? Greetings and much love from Germany/Greece. To which our friend Eduardo replies, I think he's lacking knowledge on how things work in the U.S. That would be an interesting topic, though. Why would I be lacking on knowledge of how things work in the U.S.? I opened up my first MMA gym in the U.S. I fought in the United States. I've trained at dozens of mixed martial arts training facilities in the United States. I've traveled back and forth between China and the U.S. and trained consistently in the United States and China. I'm very well familiar with the differences between what's going on there and what's going on here. Now, what many of you may not be familiar especially if you're new to this channel, is that MMA is fairly new to China. I opened up the first MMA gym in Shanghai back in 2009, the second publicly available MMA gym in the entire country of the People's Republic of China. And I'm not going to be humble about that. I helped pioneer the sport of MMA here in this country. Now, there were a bunch of other people involved in that process and still are involved in that process of pioneering the sport here in this country because still, in spite of the fact that the UFC has tried very hard to get their foot in the door, even so much as opening up their second performance institute here in Shanghai, we have a very, very long way to go. So what's different? First of all, public knowledge. The public awareness of the sport of MMA is much, much bigger in the United States than it is here. So people training in MMA here have a lot more explaining to do. There are a lot of memes out there about jiu-jitsu guys who, they say something like, my mom thinks I'm going to karate class, but I'm doing Brazilian jiu-jitsu and it's not karate. I wish people would get it straight. Where? So people have a lot of explaining to do. What is the difference between MMA and Sanda, MMA and boxing, MMA and wrestling? Why do we need this different combat sport in a cage? What's that all about? So there are a lot of conversations to be had which you probably take for granted in the United States. I spent a huge percentage of my time promoting the sport of mixed martial arts here in China, explaining some really, really basic stuff to people over and over and over again, trying to sell the sport of MMA here in this country when nobody knew what the heck it was or why they would even want to see it or participate in it or train in it. Now, as far as training differences, right now, there are now a ton of gyms out there. So people saw what was happening, they saw what I was doing, and they were like, you know what, we can capitalize on that, let's go. And suddenly all of these MMA coaches materialized out of nowhere with zero training and zero fights to their name. And it reminds me a lot of what Jack Dempsey wrote in this book right here, Championship Fighting, where he explains why he wrote this book. And it reminds me so much when he's talking about the 1950s, when he wrote this book. And, man, that's chapter 4. Let's read a little bit about that. Chapter 4, we're page 17. Why I Wrote This Book by Jack Dempsey. Naturally, I didn't make the detailed exploration of my fighting past all in one sitting. I'm a restless guy. I don't like to sit long in one place. But I became so interested in the work that sometimes I'd spend an hour or 2 hours at it. I did it on trains and planes and hotel rooms and at home. Max Wayman, my business manager, used to say, for crying out loud, Jack, what are you writing down all that junk for? You're supposed to be a memory expert. You must have all that dope about fighting right in your own head. Seems silly to see you sweating and fuming and writing notes about stuff you got at your fingertips. Well, the log of my mental journey from Manassas to Toledo filled 384 pages with closely written notes in longhand. I'm confident those 384 pages represented the most thorough study ever made by any prominent fighter of his own technique and the pointers he had received firsthand from others. But my job had only begun. I spent several months studying that massive information and separating it into different departments of self-defense under sections, subsections, subsections, etc. I waded through it again and again. I combed it, I sieved it, I sluice-boxed it for details I needed in each smallest subsection. And then into each slot I dropped any additional knowledge I had gained since Toledo. Toledo was a big fight back then. The 1919 World Heavyweight Championship, when Jack Dempsey beat Jess Willard and became boxing heavyweight champion of the world. Those different departments, with their various minor brackets, gave me for the first time a clear panorama of self-defense. I was pretty proud of my panorama. I was confident at last that I could take the rawest beginner, or even an experienced fighter, and teach him exactly what self-defense was all about. When Jack Dempsey's saying self-defense, he's not talking about poke him in the eye and kick him in the groin. He's talking about the ability to fight, to win fights in dominant fashion. That's what he's talking about, to win fights with your fists. There's been some semantic drift in that word since then. Then I became curious to compare my panorama with those other men in boxing. I talked to many fighters. This is the part I really want to get to. Many fighters, trainers, and instructors, and I read every book on boxing I could buy. My conversations and my reading left me utterly amazed at the hazy, incomplete, and distorted conceptions of self-defense possessed by many who are supposed to be experts. Man, can I ever relate to that? This is why I'm reading this to you right now. Let me repeat that one more time in case you missed it. My conversations and my reading left me utterly amazed at the hazy, incomplete, and distorted conceptions of self-defense possessed by many who are supposed to be experts. Let that sink in. That is true today, just as it was back then. The Bullshido experts, they're not brand new, and they didn't go away. And they're probably not going anywhere. Be wary, my friends. Perhaps I was unjustly critical. Perhaps none of them had had my unusual opportunities to get a blueprint that mapped all the fundamentals, at least. Or perhaps they took many fundamentals for granted and did not include them in their explanations. At any rate, I came to the conclusion that self-defense, fighting, that's what he's talking about, fighting with your fists, winning fights with your fists. I came to the conclusion that self-defense is being taught wrong nearly everywhere for the following major reasons. Number one, beginners are not grounded in the four principal methods of putting the body weight into fast motion. Falling step A. B. Leg spring. C. Shoulder whirl. D. Upward surge. Man, I remember I made a video about the shoulder whirl, and everybody who tried it out, man, they were like, this is gold. I can't believe it. My punches got instantly better. Why did nobody ever teach me this? This is amazing. I've been boxing for years, and nobody ever taught me this. And the folks who just watched and didn't even try it out, sitting in their chair like they could have, just pulling that shoulder back a couple of inches, typed angry, this would never work in a fight. This isn't what my instructor taught me, blah, blah, blah. Well, your instructor taught you wrong, man. D. Upward surge. 2. The extremely important power line in punching seems to have been forgotten. Amen, Jack Dempsey. The wholesale failure, number 3, the wholesale failure of instructors and trainers to appreciate the close cooperation necessary between the power line and weight motion results generally in impure punching, weak hitting. 4, explosive straight punching has become almost a lost art because instructors place so much emphasis on shoulder whirl that beginners are taught wrongfully to punch straight without stepping whenever possible. And 5, failure to teach the falling step, the trigger step for straight punching, has resulted in the left jab being used generally as a light auxiliary weapon for making openings and setting up, instead of a stunning blow, putting it in quotation marks on the setting up, because it's not really a setup unless you unbalance your opponent, as Mr. Dempsey taught us later, which is 100% true. It is not a setup unless your opponent is unbalanced. That's true in boxing, it's true in judo, it's true in MMA, it's true in every combat sport. I am sick and tired of seeing these know-nothing experts making these videos on the internet saying, here's a great setup for this move, and then showing something which does nothing to set your move up. Besides waving a finger in the other guy's face, which doesn't unbalance him, doesn't distract him, doesn't move him, doesn't get a reaction, doesn't generate movement, does nothing. Nothing. I'm pragmatic about fighting because when you're not, you get hurt. And people that trust you get hurt. And it is not worth it. It is not worth it. No amount of praise and accolade is worth that on your conscience. Don't be that guy. Don't be the self-proclaimed expert, man. Number 6, beginners are not shown the difference between shovel hooks and uppercuts. It's shocking how few people know what a shovel hook is. They think they do, and a lot of them have no clue. Number 7, beginners are not warned that taking long steps with hooks may open up those hooks into swings. It is shocking how many people can't tell the difference between a swing and a hook. Man, before this Shanghai lockdown, I was going to make a video about hooks. I probably still will from the comfort of my own home. But people need to know what the heck a hook is. You think you know, and I guarantee 80% of you have no clue what a hook is, and you're swinging, you're not hooking. 8, the bob and weave rarely is explained properly. Oh, and how to this day. To this day, people training with pro boxers think they've got it all figured out because those pro boxers taught them wrong and they have no clue what bobbing and weaving even is. 9, the necessity for three-knuckle landing is never pointed out, and this is hotly disputed because without a boxing glove in karate classes and taekwondo classes, these two big knuckles, bare knuckle, there's a lot of advantages and certain positions where these two knuckles are the optimal weapon, and yet, this whole part of the fist in proper alignment, and the Wing Chun nerds are probably screaming in excitement, yay, he's acknowledging us, he's validating my beliefs. Well, guess what else? A lot of the other stuff you Wing Chun nerds are doing are wrong anyway, and three-knuckle contact is not going to make up for that. Anyway, you gotta know and appreciate the difference between two and three-knuckle contact. There's a time and a place for both. Number 10, it is my personal belief that beginners should be taught all types of punches before being instructed in defensive moves. You gotta learn the offense if you want to learn to defend it. I'm constantly plagued with questions. Ramsey, how do I defend a takedown? You learn a takedown. How do I defend this submission? You learn that submission. How do I defend against the aggressive puncher? You become the aggressive puncher. You learn the thing you want to defend against, and you learn it inside and out. Anyway, I love this chapter. I love this book so much. Go buy it. Go read it. Go download it free PDF. It's public domain. Or get yourself a hard copy or a paperback copy like this one and read it and love it till the thing falls apart and it ends up in your brain, and then make a list of notes just like Dempsey did and catalog everything you have learned, and your knowledge will explode. So why am I bringing all that up? Because I had something to offer, and I systemized it, and I began teaching it, and then all these know-nothings sprang up out of nowhere trying to make a buck off of it, opening up these gyms often outfitted with the best equipment money could buy, financed by real estate moguls, bankers, etc., trying to cash in on this new MMA craze with no idea of how to teach it. And so what ended up happening, a lot of the MMA gyms, what did they do? They went to YouTube and they said, well, what are they doing in America? And they looked at what they were doing in America and they tried to copy it. And some of that is good and a lot of that is bad, because how do most American MMA gyms operate? Well, I'll tell you, here's how they operate. Most of them. And most of them are not particularly good. Most gyms in general are not particularly good. Individuals can make them good. Individuals can have great training practices, but by and large, here's the system. You have an MMA gym. They don't ever teach the sport of MMA. They don't ever coach the sport of MMA. They got a jiu-jitsu class and they got a Muay Thai class, and they have them at separate times. And people come to me and say, hey, Ramsey, I go to this MMA gym, but we don't actually do any MMA sparring. What do I do? Do MMA sparring. Put on the gloves and spar, man. You got to put it all together. You've got to teach the sport of MMA as its own unique sport, and you got to appreciate that. And that is one of these things that I brought to China, and a few very great, awesome coaches that I love and respect here in this country are still doing that to this day. Some of my students have gone on to open up their own gyms in other provinces across this country, and they teach what I taught them, and they are improving upon that, and they're training some great fighters, and they're essentially evangelizing MMA out there, and it's awesome. So, what are the differences? Not too much in the fact that everybody's a human and everybody tries to cash in on bullshito, and very few people try to do it the right way, because the right way is harder and the right way takes work. I mean, just think about it for a minute, the way Jack Dempsey started that chapter, that he did a lot of work. He did his homework, even when people told him not to. What are you writing all that stuff for? What are you cataloging all this stuff for? Why are you doing all this mental work when you know it all? Why? Because he wanted to teach it. He wanted to share that information. He wanted to create the formula for pedagogy, for perfect fighting, to most efficiently communicate these skills to other people who needed them. Now, there are cultural differences. We could yammer about a huge percentage of fighters in China who end up competing in MMA got their start in Chinese sports universities in Sanda. If you're not familiar with Sanda, it's Chinese kickboxing. It's a combat sport where you can kick and you can punch and you can grapple. You do the quick throws where you remain standing and your opponent goes down. So there are a lot of judo, Greco-Roman style throws, and some very interesting ones unique to Sanda. You do it in boxing gloves, which makes it a very unique challenge, grappling in boxing gloves. But I think that's something I started doing a lot of, is doing grappling drills in boxing gloves, wrestling in boxing gloves, because if you can do it with the boxing gloves, doing it in the MMA gloves is super easy. So there is a big influence from Sanda, from Chinese Sanda, which is awesome. It is awesome. And I would love to see that Sanda influence make it to America. If I ever move back to the United States, I will definitely be teaching the sport of Sanda alongside mixed martial arts. At whatever gym I open up there, should I move back one of these days. But yeah, man, Sanda is it's a great sport, man. Especially if you're subdividing MMA into striking and grappling. That's kind of silly to separate it into striking and grappling. A lot of people laud Greg Jackson as one of the great MMA coaches of all time, let alone one of the great MMA coaches in America. And he published a couple of books with Victory Belt Publishing on MMA. To give you a quick rundown of a bunch of stand-up techniques and a bunch of grappling ground techniques. I shouldn't separate into striking and grappling, because he didn't. There were two books, the stand-up game and the ground game. Not the striking game and the grappling game. No, the stand-up game is both striking and grappling in mixed martial arts, and Greg Jackson points that out pragmatically in his book. The ground game is both striking and grappling, once again, as Greg Jackson points out in the book, and I love the fact that he did that. I love the fact that he did that. That is so incredibly important. So that's one thing that hybrid sports like Sanda do, is they make you painfully aware that grappling happens at the same time as striking. Now, there are some problems, and they're the same, but importantly different types of problems that exist with cross-training in just Muay Thai. Because Sanda eliminates the dirty boxing aspect, and by dirty boxing I just mean hitting in the clinch. That's all dirty boxing means. There's a lot of misunderstanding about dirty boxing. It just means laying a hand on the other guy, holding him while you hit. If you're doing dirty boxing, that's an illegal move in the sport of boxing. The referee will give you this signal. That means holding. That's a foul. There will be some consequences, and you'll get a warning from the referee, etc. He may deduct some points if it continues. Now, holding and hitting, we see that in Muay Thai all the time. It's part of the game. You hold the guy, you hit him. You hold him, you elbow him. You hold him, you knee him. You clinch him, you trip him, you sweep him. But if you read Lumpini Boxing Stadium rules, no wrestling and no judo techniques allowed. Now, that's not exactly true because they allow a lot of sweeps and trips, which are perfectly legal and common in all forms of wrestling and judo. But what they mean by that is no grabbing the legs and doing double legs and single legs, no hip throws, no uchimata, no ogoshi, no soenage, nothing like that. So sweeps and trips, fine. But if you combine those two elements, the dirty boxing from Muay Thai, the clinch fighting from Muay Thai, and the wrestling and the takedowns from Sanda with the striking, and just stop calling it style, stop calling it Sanda, stop calling it Muay Thai, and just call it the stand-up game, great. Great. That's applicable to MMA. And instead of focusing exclusively on grappling, focus on the ground game, which is far from just grappling. Anyway, I'm getting on a tangent here. But yeah, just like Jack Dempsey back in the 50s, when he wrote this book, a lot of people in America are doing it wrong. A lot of people in China are doing it wrong because they're following the blind. Some people are doing it right. And I make it a point to stay in contact with as many people who are doing it right as possible, to stay as educated and as open and as informed and on top of the game as I can around the world, not just in China, not just in the US, but around the world. Man, we have this amazing thing called the internet that allows us to do that these days. So it's not just an American thing versus a Chinese thing, it's a worldwide phenomenon now. So let's pay attention, guys. Thank you for watching. Now get out there and train.